Velkommen to min fjord, and welcome back, guys, to Sailing Through the Fjords. This is episode 2. Just want to thank you guys for watching the first episode, and if this is your first, welcome. So this is, again, it's just like an easy chat show while I make more structured content for the podcast and do all the other things that I do, coalescence and painting and my local hobby community and all those sorts of stuff. I just wanted to share some painting, share some thoughts and ideas, just like really snappy little snippets. And if you guys need something to have on in the background while you paint, or something that you guys want to just get some thoughts about what's happening in the Warhammer community right now, this is one way to get it. So, before we get into the topic specifically, this week it's Warhammer Legends, which is Games Workshop is bringing back some old heroes. We don't know who specifically, but they're bringing back some old heroes. And there's a lot of people who are very positive to this, and I'm a bit more skeptical. But before we get into that, I'm going to show you some old models. So for the Warhammer connoisseurs out there, this is an old Teclis model. And that's right, that's Teclis of the Deepkin fame. I just wanted to show this sort of because obviously we had the Deepkin chat last week. Really interesting faction in a lot of ways, and this sort of shows where they came from. I'm going to guess, without having looked very hard at the Ideneth models, there's probably going to be some overlap in design with this guy. Probably not a lot, but some. But just because there's a new aesthetic, but they really like tying it back to the old, and that's part of the whole story of the Ideneth, and there's a lot of cool details there. And I want to show you guys some old models, just to color the chat that we're going to have in a bit about the Warhammer Legends initiative. I'm going to show you guys that I have a love and a passion for a certain age of old models, actually usually newer old models. I'm not what you would call traditionally a old hammer collector, which is like 5th edition and earlier. My favorite stuff is usually 6th edition or newer. So this is actually just a really simple high elf wizard model, really. It is an old Teclis model, not the newest one as far as I can tell. And if you want to know a fun fact, this is actually the first earth and grass base I have ever made. All my other bases have been different. So I bet you guys don't really care, but I think that's kind of fun. All right, our next model is a little bit more ambitious, a little bit more interesting, I think. This is the old Tyrion model. So those of you who are just Age of Sigmar fans, you came in with the release of Age of Sigmar, this is what the now elven god used to look like. Now, in the old world, he shared the color scheme of Teclis and all the other high elves with the white and the blue, but I have painted him up as Tyrion, the avatar of Cain. Now, for those of you keeping your eyes up, your ears open, that means that this guy was the avatar of the Iron Heart of Cain that Marathi now has, which is just showing you guys the interconnectedness of the elves in a way that Age of Sigmar at the moment isn't communicating very well. But as we get more elves in our hands and in our books and all that sort of stuff, we'll start seeing more of these connections. So essentially, this is evil Teclis, which is obviously why he's red and black. That's a hard denominator of someone being evil. Now, this model is actually quite old. I was about to say several hundred years. That's Teclis himself. The model's not quite that old. I believe it's released in 6th edition, so it's still got a huge amount of dynamic posing. It used to be a favorite of conversions back in the day. You just remove Teclis and put on some different rider, and you had a great pose. And he's also got this little high elf or dark elf, now probably some sort of Darkling Coven elf, on his base, which is a cool little cinematic detail. Because Tyrion was the defender of Ulthuan, and what he was defending against was dark elves. So yeah, if you guys have seen my battle tome, The End Times, then you've seen this model representing Cain and representing Tyrion, the avatar of Cain. I've even tried to paint the blade here as the Widowmaker. Obviously, it's Sunfang, just painted red, but bear with me. I'm working with what I have. So yeah, this is one of my... as an idea, it's one of my favorite models. I'm not actually a huge fan of the elf aesthetic in general, but I just love that this is the avatar of Cain. I think it strikes a pose, and it strikes a story beat with me, which makes it really fun to have in my collection. And it's also another sand and grass base, which I'm actually really enjoying using. I won't use them for my Age of Sigmar armies in general, but when you've gone 15 years having sand or jungle or snow or something else, just going back to this classic basing, it feels kind of right in a very strange way. Alright, so I've shown you some elves. Now it's time to show you some dwarves, or duardin as they're known now. This is an old school rune lord with Anvil of Doom. So this isn't the earliest model, but I do believe it is released in 6th edition. Might be earlier, but it's just... it's something to be said for this kind of model. I think it's got a story to tell. Now, before I talk too much about it, it does have a bit of a conversion. This arm with the flame in that is not the original arm. That is from the newer Rune Lord kit. But it just fits so perfectly here that I had to use it. And now this is an old kit, and it comes with this round runic base, which is what you would play it on in game as well. And in the old Warhammer Fantasy battles, where you had all these, everything was square based and based on line of sights from the squares and maneuvering around squares. Having bases like this were really, really cool and interesting and narrative. And you just look at this model and it immediately tells you a story. You know, you've got a guy who's hitting a rune, and you know, he's not making a weapon, he's doing something magical. He's got two stout looking dwarves with really long beards. They go down to their feet. That means that these guys are professionals. And I just love that kind of storytelling through a model. So if we sort of zoom it around a bit here, I really need one of those turntables, don't I? If I'm going to show you the whole thing. So it's just, it's a sort of intricacy in the models that you don't see these days. And I don't mean that either positive or negative. I actually kind of dislike painting parts of this model because the characters themselves have so many tiny details that don't take paint very well. Let's see if we can show that. So if you can sort of see the back of the back here, he has a lot of items hanging from his belt, a lot of like keys and stuff. And a lot of those things, they're not hard to paint, but they do require extra effort. But it's worth it in the end because you get the wholeness of the model, and it just tells a cool story. And I just really love it. It's just, I'm really, really proud of how this turned out, especially with the flame effect, meaning that it is like it's a centerpiece, and the flame becomes a centerpiece within a centerpiece. And I'm so happy with how that turned out. And now for something a bit newer. This is also a dwarf, the old High King Thorgrim. Another great characterful piece model. Characterful model. There's a lot of story when you just look at this model. He's obviously someone important being carried on a throne of some sort. He's got the Book of Grudges in front of him. He's got this big axe that he's holding. He's pointing. He's in command. It's just, you can tell a lot out of this model just from looking at it. And it was actually both really enjoyable and really weird to paint. Like, all the little dwarves, the throne bearers, they all suffer a bit from the same like detail density that the Rune Lord, that the old Thorek Rune Lord model has. Then the throne itself is just like all gold and quite, it's not even like painting Stormcast. It's both more and less textured in a way. Like, it doesn't take paint as well. But overall, this was just a really, really, really fun project, and I'm so glad I was able to get one of these models. I actually bought them slightly before they went out of production, so this is a fine cast model, which had a few issues that have been green stuffed. And like fun details, he's got the Book of Grudges, which I've tried to make it look like it's painted in blood. Now, this was painted a long time ago, so I'm a better painter now than I was when I painted this. But another one of my favorite old models, a favorite old story, the old Thorgrim book is a lot of fun. And honestly, I wish the Dispossessed, who this guy used to be able to be taken with, had more stuff like this still in it. So we've talked good guys for quite a bit. We've talked a bad guy in Kane, or the avatar of Kane, but here's Archaon. Now this is a model that anyone who played Warhammer Fantasy Battles remembers with a bit of fondness. This is probably the most iconic and classic mounted model in the whole game. It immediately draws your attention to the painting of Napoleon in almost the same pose. There's a painting of, I believe it's Alexander the Great with his horse, which is quite similar, sort of from this angle. Obviously, the pose is commanding. The detail is just enough to tell you that this guy doesn't mess around. But he's not ostentatious or over the top. This is a warlord. And this is Archaon. It's the forebearer of the much, 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 much larger model. But in a lot of people's mind, more iconic. And I had a conversation about this on Twitter. that this pose here, this pose right here, is one of those movie slow-mo moments. You know, the guy rears up and he points and he's just done or about to do some epic speech, and the camera goes into slow motion, and that becomes a still image that becomes promotional material for the movie and all sorts of stuff like that. And that's one of those things that makes this model so iconic. Whereas the modern Archeon model is much more fluid. It has much more actual movement. It's much more as if it's caught in the middle of a moving scene and not as a deliberate highlight of the character. Which are two completely different styles of posing. I think a lot of people will find the new Archeon less iconic, but I'd say it's just more a difference of how they've done it rather than the technical ability of them. But yeah, this model is just it was such a joy to paint and experiment on, and he is now the cover boy of Battletome Archeon, part of the Battletome The End Time series. So yeah, quite probably one of the most famous models in Warhammer. For those of you who never got around to getting into Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Alright, last of our little retro models here for today. It's Vultan Exalted on Warhorse. Now this was a Storm of Chaos model, which was a global campaign in 2003 or 2004. Which is actually when the new Archeon model, the one I just showed you, was also released. So these two were sort of paired off against one another. So you can sort of see here Galmaraz, the armor. So if any of you have looked at some of the artwork of Sigmar in the Age of Sigmar, you see a lot of design similarities with this guy. He's got the same sort of armor, the same sort of hair. Obviously, he's got the Warhammer itself, all that sort of stuff. And it's just, I love this armor. I love its pose. It's like, it's heroic rather than aggressive. So he's making what in many countries would be considered a rude gesture with his fingers, holding up the two fingers. But it's also the sign of the twin-tailed comet. You know, if your palm or your fist is the comet, then your fingers are sort of the trail, and it just shows that this is, rather than a combat moment, this is right before combat. He makes the gesture against his enemy or to worship Sigmar, and then goes into battle. Like, you could imagine this, and then it just straight up goes charging out. And I wanted to show you guys this sort of both the size difference of these guys, because obviously Archeon is massive, but also a lot of older fans will have good memories of the Storm of Chaos book with an image of these two guys next to each other. And that's actually part of the reason I worked so hard to get a hold of both of these models, so that I could put them up next to each other and sort of recreate this image, because I have a lot of good memories myself, and I'm so happy that I can get them and paint them up, and maybe one day even get to play with them. Because we're getting the Warhammer Legends. That's going to be the topic right now. Alright, so I've showed you guys some of my old models, and old in the sense that out of production rather than 20, 30 years old, just 15. I wanted to talk about something Games Workshop is calling Warhammer Legends. So what Warhammer Legends is, apparently, is that after the community survey which Games Workshop had, I don't know if you guys remembered it. I think it was just about before Christmas. They sent out a giant survey and they asked people, please fill them out. One result was Plastic Sisters of Battle. Cool for everyone who wants that. And one of the other results was Warhammer Legends. So this is not apparently Warhammer Fantasy Battles getting new rules. This is actually a way for you guys to play with the actual old characters in Age of Sigmar. And they talk about how it's both rules and narrative. So let's see if we can get the right picture up here. No, don't have that one. All right. Anyways, according to Games Workshop's website on Warhammer Community, this is a way to play with your characters in regular Age of Sigmar. And I think that's interesting in a couple of ways. One, that used to be possible. That used to be completely possible until Games Workshop themselves removed that possibility. We used to have, well, we still have compendiums, which have rules for older models. Now, these used to be really, really full, like in-depth compendiums for all the old armies. Because this was before we got stuff like Grand Alliance Order, Grand Alliance Chaos, that took all the old stuff and made sure it became new. This was literally like Warriors of Chaos or Lizardmen or Tomb Kings with Age of Sigmar rules, and not, Slaves to Darkness or Seraphon. But in those compendiums, you had the rules for all the special characters. So Tyrion, Teclis, Volton, all these guys that I've shown you now had their own specific rules. And in the General's Handbook 2016, they had points, making them matched play legal. So when Games Workshop announced this and said, oh, you can play with your old stuff again, we used to. I can because I still have those old PDFs. But someone who buys a collection online, or someone who has all the old models but didn't download the PDF on the assumption that these would always be available, or that Games Workshop would give them notice and say, we're changing how these things work, download these if you want to keep using them. So it's sort of them celebrating bringing back something that they removed, which I don't like that approach. I'll say that. I like that they're doing it, but I don't like the approach. I don't like them failing to recognize that they are bringing back something that they also took away. I guess it's something like when McDonald's brings back the McRib. I'm just doing this on hearsay because we don't have the McRib in the Norway. But apparently it's a big thing. I'm like, it's being brought back. Oh my god. But why was it removed? So I like my companies to be a bit more transparent in that sense. I want them to say, oh, it turns out it was a mistake removing the old stuff. Here's it back. Sorry, guys. Or we really understand that you guys are passionate about the old stuff. So we're making it... So we're bringing them back from where they were and doing something new with them. Or however, I just want them to make sure that they can't pretend that they're always giving us gifts if they were the ones that took them away. And I want to show you guys an example of that. Not that one. Not that one. There we go. So, on that side, you can see two different war scrolls. One on the top here for High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer, which is the model you guys just saw. and the other one for the Warden King on Throne of Power. Now, look at those stats. Are they similar? Yes, they are. Because it's the same thing. The Warden King on Throne of Power is from one of the newer compendiums which replaced the old ones. And look at that. Oh, your favorite heroes are coming back? He used to be there. He used to have his own rules for Age of Sigmar. But then they changed it. They changed the Warden King. And now he's still got rules, but it's not Thorgrim. And they also did two more things that are quite important for gameplay rather than story. One of which, they removed a lot of the keywords. Look at the keywords on those War Scrolls. Thorgrim has Dispossessed. Thorgrim's buffs apply to dispossessed models. Thorgrim has a command ability that affects other duardin. The Warden King doesn't. So the Warden King, the king, can't function with other duardin models. And they did this to a lot of units, a lot of stuff. They probably... this guy's probably the guy they butchered the most. He used to be able to do all sorts of stuff for other dispossessed models. But now he can only buff himself with charging, plus a save or do some damage. Like, the model has a 1-inch move. It's become useless. So, when Games Workshop are talking about how they're bringing back your favorite heroes and characters, they used to have them, and they broke them. Now, some have gotten a buff. Cetra from the Tomb Kings became generic, which means that he kept all of his rules. They changed the keywords so that the Tomb Kings are internally consistent, and they work. So Cetra can now take command abilities and command traits and artifacts, which is awesome. But none of these other heroes, none of these other characters, and a lot of the old compendium stuff either disappeared completely or became incompatible with the existing armies. And I think that's a shame. So I don't know how Games Workshop wants to do it, but we have some story hints on how they intend to do it, which is this one. Let's put that. Oops, that's me. So, this is the end of the Dread Solstice campaign. When the campaign ended, all sorts of stuff was happening, and apparently one of the things was there were so many souls sacrificed that went into the Great Oubliette, which is, apparently I googled this, and it's a prison or a cell where the only entrance is from a trapdoor on the top. So if you just literally dig a hole and put a door on top of it, that's an oubliette. And look at the words. Heroes and villains of ages past escape, and the souls of legends of both the past and the present. Which is, I mean, you could say it's probably just some Age of Sigmar era stuff, but it's also combined with this legend stuff. I think this is a way to try to narratively get Age of Sigmar models or old Warhammer Fantasy models narratively into the Age of Sigmar, and I don't like that. And that's a bold statement. I don't like that because I believe the Age of Sigmar should develop its own unique set of characters. And I've caught some flack for this because Gotrek is coming back from Gotrek and Felix, and I don't really like that either. And he's searching for Felix and thinks he's a Stormcast Eternal, which I think would be terrible for the story. And I mentioned this a bit with the Adepticon and how I love what their story potential is and what they bring to the setting. And my issue with bringing old heroes into the new setting is that they might overshadow Age of Sigmar. It might just become round-based Warhammer Fantasy, which isn't what it should be. I hope the Games Workshop, the rules designers, the background writers, and whoever decides what models end up going into production, have the courage to let the setting be its own thing, to let this unique story potential of Age of Sigmar develop. I mean, here's an issue. How many named characters do you know from the Age of Sigmar? If you go and ask a veteran who's played Warhammer Fantasy Battles, so that's apparently really hard to say, he'll have dozens of characters and he can just list them straight up. And one of those issues is that they haven't spent enough time developing the setting, developing the characters, developing the consequences of their actions, and the personalities that make them do actions with consequences. And they're building to that. I think Malign Portents is a great way to build up to that. I think they've done a lot of good work lately with fleshing out the world, with giving it depth, with giving it potential consequence. But they need to let that have time. They need to let that setting exist, flesh it out, make each of the races something that we can instinctively care about, with characters that we care about. If you don't do that, and then you throw in a bunch of old characters that we love and adore from the old days, you might risk losing any focus and any ability to capture the spirit of Age of Sigmar in itself. And that would be so disappointing, because the novels released in 2017, the stuff that we're looking forward to, they all capture a spirit that is uniquely Age of Sigmar, and that's what I want to keep. So, in conclusion, without drawing this out too long, I really like the idea of bringing back the rules for the old models. I just want Games Workshop to say sorry about removing them in the first place. And secondly, I am afraid that they won't bring the characters narratively back into the setting in a way that provides more rather than less meaning. If any old character that's dead, and let's face it, you can resurrect, say, Queek, and there's a text out there somewhere who mentions Skaven warlords. If you can resurrect him, a guy who was strangled to death years before the setting ended, you could bring back anyone. You could bring back Kalidor Dragon Tamer. You could bring back Gotrek Starbreaker. You could bring back Sigmar's actual physical body, which would be kind of weird. Obviously, they don't have a model for that, but you could bring back Vlad von Karstein, Manfred's bloodfather, who had an excellent ending in the end times. And if you bring him back, you lose all meaning. The story loses all meaning. If death has no consequence, and the Malign Portents are trying to tell us that they do, the stories about life and death are meaningless. And there's not enough meat on the rest of Age of Sigmar's bones to make drama about stuff that isn't life and death meaningful. Yet. So, those are my concerns. You see one of these other images here. Not that one. That one. Oh, that's a bit big. One of the advantages, one of the really cool things, though, is that Games Workshop are out to make money, obviously. So when they're bringing back the narrative stuff and bringing back the rules, they're doing made-to-order for old models. And the first one that they announced were the Dark Elves. So if you have some Dark Elf heroes, probably these guys, that you missed out on back in the day, you better make sure that you are prepared for made to order, because that's going to be great. I'm going to buy that Lokir Fellheart model, the squid head guy, and maybe the Morathi. And, you know, we could see all sorts of amazing models that are almost impossible to get. And I'm looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to playing with them in my games, in my narrative, or without narrative, or all sorts of stuff. So overall, I think it's an interesting idea and an interesting thing to do. I like that they're listening to what we want, but I also want them to acknowledge that they made the mistake in the first place, and I'm unsure of how they're going to integrate it all. One last thing that I didn't mention, these won't have matched play rules apparently. They said in the announcement that this is for like narrative or open play and not for pitched battle. So there's quite likely they'll get rules, but they won't get points, which is a decision, probably a good one. Like, that means that they can just drop them and I don't need to worry about that. But if you're worried that some sort of old super buff is going to come back, probably not going to happen for your tournaments. But you're going to watch out for your open play or narrative games. Anyways, that's it for this time. Made to order, Warhammer Legends, all really cool, interesting stuff. I'm looking forward to see how they do it, but I am a bit cautious because I'm not sure if Games Workshop is willing to forego the community's wish to bring back their old favorite stuff in favor of sticking to their guns and developing the setting. Maybe I'm selling them a bit short. They did, after all, blow up the old one. But now that they're listening and there's a bunch of people screaming at them, I'm worried that they're going to listen. Which sounds really elitist of me, but I'm team AOS, not team Warhammer Fantasy Battles and its impronounceable name. But alright. Happy painting, guys. And until next time, ha det bra!